My name is Michael Krasny. I have a PhD in literature from the University of Wisconsin and have been a professor of English at San Francisco State. In its study, and also provides a reality that many believe to be superior in its overall effects on what we normally believe reality to be. We read and interpret stories to enter into the exciting life of the mind and to see. As the poet Adrienne Rich said, what we see, and seeing is changing. Let's have a brief look at the short story and its history, the arc of the stories we will be studying, and a consideration of how we interpret meaning and evaluate fiction. Edgar Allan Poe defined the short story generally as not being as long as a novel or novella, or what at one time later on would be called a novelette. In other words, short enough to read and absorb in a single sitting. Short stories can be any an oral history, but also located in myths and biblical stories and the anecdotes of ancient Rome. They have their origins also in fables, folk tales with moral exempla built in, like Aesop, who gave us such famous fables as The Tortoise and the Hare. Western and European stories and tales have their origins in poetic forms of the 14th century, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron. We'll see in a number of the short fiction writers who we'll be discussing works of short fiction that, like the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales, fit into larger works. There are stories that are read and taught as stories that are, in fact, part of the much broader canvas of a novel, but that can nevertheless stand alone as short stories. The modern short story bloomed in the 19th century, with the market created by journals and magazines, often shocking or horror stories like the Grimm fairy tales, or German tales of shock and horror. In the United States, these were the stories of Washington Irving, the most famous being the ones about the legendary Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, and the tale of Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep when King George is ruling the colonies and wakes up 20 years later to the visage of General George Washington. Short fiction appeared and flourished nearly simultaneously in the United States and Russia. It flourished later in France, where Poe was greatly admired, and later still in the British Empire, where big novels, often serialized, held sway. In Ireland and in German-speaking Europe, where medium-length novellas had been more the norm for short fiction. The trajectory of storytelling, as we look at the masters of 2 centuries, moves from simple, highly plotted tales to increasing realism, putting the mirror up to nature, and then to forms of experimentation and an increased opening up in fiction to the complexities of modern life, psychological, racial, ethnic, sexual, and identity-based. That is, there's a movement from realism to modernism, from realism with some elements of the allegorical or moral tale, the fabulous tale, based on myth and fable, and the surreal tales, built from the unconscious mind, to more modernist stories, both steeped in realism or built on fabulism and parable, myth, self-reflexivity, autobiography, or history. Voices change as writers open up to younger voices, ethnicity, and gender, and what we see in the evolution of short fiction masterpieces is a changing canon. That's the established body of what is deemed to be great literature. And a changing marketplace that is increasingly cross-cultural, cosmopolitan, and global. The key to understanding stories is often vested in what we call intertextuality, stories building on other stories through the progression II era who explored personal terrain through the creation of characters who confess the secret content of their hidden inner lives. What we want is to discover what makes the stories we'll be discussing great, and why and how they yield richness of meaning and, in addition to interpretation, how we evaluate their worth. This can sometimes be challenging, even vexing. But there are essentially four major ways of interpreting and evaluating short fiction, and each of the four is intimately connected to craft and to the tale's impact on readers. These are four good touchstones to assessing what a masterpiece is. First, there's the text, looking at the language in the story, its metaphors, symbolism, meanings that we can attribute to the author's choice of words. We'll read text between about 1,000 and 15,000 words. Secondly, the author, his or her personal history and psychology, influences and cultural background, all of which can and often do go beyond and outside the text. We're going to read to authorial genius and the effect and impact of the story on a wide range of readers, to the universality of the story's themes and ideas, its emotional and empathic and evocative power, its originality, and frankly, on this professor's scholarly and personal choices. Greatness is also inextricably linked to form and content, language, or what's called stylistics, and craft, and to the meaning that the individual story yields, how and to what degree it moves or stirs us, and how or to what extent it lasts or is likely to endure. When I was in graduate school, we used to have the notion that there would be a space capsule that would go into the future. What works would we want to include in that space capsule? As if we could decide somehow what would be the best works for ongoing generations. But what better place to begin a course on masterpieces of short fiction than with the earliest American master of suspense, Edgar Allan Poe, who has given us such classic stories as The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Cask of Amontillado, which is the first story we will focus on. We begin with Poe in this course because of his emphasis on plot and unity, and a credible-sounding, though quite possibly unreliable, narrator. And we move through stories of greater realism and more open plots. Sometimes no plots at all, as we venture also into some of the experimental fiction of the 20th century. Poe was also a seminal figure in the Usher reader. As we'll discover, these are often indistinct lines that can be grossly exaggerated. We begin with Poe also because Poe was a pathfinding theorist of the short story who grounds us in a theory of short fiction and its effects. He wrote an early disputation, one of the earliest on record, about the singular effect of the short story. The Importance of the Single Effect in a Prose Tale was published in 1842, and in it, Poe used Nathaniel Hawthorne as an example of a storyteller who provides what only the short story can provide for a reader. Unlike the novel, with a story like The Cask of Amontillado, Poe's great tale of suspense and revenge, the effects on us as readers emerge from a single sitting. Only a handful of pages, and Poe transports us to a world of masquerades and motley, a carnivalesque world of conical caps and bells, and then into an underground world of catacombs and skeletons, and into what appears to be a perfect crime, a grotesque and calculated premeditated murder, a live burial narrated by the murderer from the perch of a half-century later. The emphasis in this story is on plot, a compressed narrative that comes to us through the authentic and riveting voice of a murderer. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length, I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with Motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival." "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado?" "I have my doubts." "Amontillado! And I must satisfy them." "Amontillado!" "As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me Lucchese cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. Come, let us go." So you see how he tells his story in terms of it being in the present, even though it is from that half century before. And you get a sense of a very distinctive voice here, telling us how he ensnared this man, how he really entrapped him, got him to come with him into the catacombs, which is where they go essentially with Montrezor de with stones and mortar. Montrezor may indeed be mad, but he's credible. And from the outset, we're swept up into a story of shock and horror that is relentless. The ultimate terrifying campfire story. It appeared, by the way, a year after Poe's famous poem, The Raven, and just after the last of his 3 detective stories. Poe is seminal, as I said. He's a poet, as well as an editor, a novelist, as well as a short story writer, an essayist. Let's talk about his background a little. He was actually expelled from West Point, and he lived a life afflicted by poverty, poor health, depression, and addiction. His wife, Virginia Clem, who was also his 13-year-old first cousin, died young. And though his stories sold well all over the world, and he published some 70 tales, his literary income as a short story writer never exceeded hundreds of dollars. Let's look at what makes Poe's horror story great by starting with the fact that the story is a perfect example of what Poe's aesthetic theory of a single sitting was based on. That is, the belief in the overall effect of reading a work in one sitting. Poe also believed that truth is the aim of the tale, and he was doubtlessly influenced by the classic thinking we see in the Poetics by Aristotle, the notion that great literary art, specifically tragedy, creates a cathartic or purging effect of pity and terror, and reveals the hubris or pride of characters. The Cask of Amontillado reflects the Aristotelian notion of catharsis, of pity and fear, and the 2 main characters in different ways are suffused with hubris or pride, one in his wine connoisseurship, the other in what he relates as his perfect murder. The essential conflict of revenge is sustained from the story's beginning to its conclusion. To be directly confiding in after 50 years from the murderous act. Passage I just read where he says, "You who know my soul so well." Who's he addressing that to, if not us as readers? Why is he telling this story now? And to whom? To us? Maybe to someone else? What are his real motives? And just how reliable is his version of what occurred in the nitro-filled underground where he lures with the wonderful Sherry Amontillado a man who thinks he is a friend? Well, Montrezor may be unreliable, possibly in a woman named Princess Maria Bonaparte, who was a patient of Freud's and a psychoanalytic critic, and she said in her analysis of the Cask of Amontillado that we see all these wine bottles, and these are obviously phallic symbols. Well, Freud also was at one point given to reminding us that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But this story does get us into deep psychological levels, psychoanalytical levels, if you will. And the relationship of the tale to the reader is complex and really quite artful. Montrezor even seems to be directly addressing us, as I said, and we can all be cast a bit like Fortunato, dressed up as fools in a similar role, because you, the reader of the story, like Fortunato, are being left to try. Envy. Montrezor seems to have fallen. He says of Fortunato that you are happy as I once was, rich, respected, admired, beloved, as I once was. Fortunato, as in the word fortune, is noble, and Lucchese, the other wine connoisseur who's mentioned in the story, has a name which suggests lucre or money. Poe had neither fortune nor money. And his stepfather, John Allen, who adopted Poe after Poe's father died when Poe was only 3, was, like Fortunato, a mason, as well as a man who considered himself a wine connoisseur. Fortunato exclaims to Montrezor, not without contempt, "You, impossible, a Mason?" And Montrezor becomes a different kind of Mason as he uses a trowel to build tears that will suffocate Fortunato. Perhaps psychobiographers who look for meaning in the life of the author might argue Poe was wreaking a kind of vengeance on his stepfather, as well as for the impoverished and unhappy life he lived. The great Argentinian fiction writer Jorge Luis Borges pithily once said of Poe, "He lived a short and unhappy life, if unhappiness can be short." The story was published in 1846 in Godey's Lady's Book, a popular mid-19th century venue for short fiction, which also published Hawthorne, and reflects the popular interest in stories that carry sensation and horror, and stories of revenge. This popular interest in stories that convey both horror and sensation continues to the present day, and interestingly enough was reflected in an episode of the television series Homicide, based on The Cask of Amontillado, in which is a kind of tribute to Poe, and the show's even a deeper psychology. If his heart is growing sick and he says it must be because of the dampness of the catacombs, are we to believe him? Or is he perhaps unreliable? Is his conscience or his unconscious playing a role in perhaps precipitating some guilt? There are weaknesses in this story, despite its singular effect and the building up to its climactic impact. It's histrionic. It has what can be described as, I suppose, a puerile style. Henry James called it primitive, and T.S. Eliot called Poe gifted but before puberty. The characters are not flat, but they are somewhat psychologically abstract, and there's a sense of gimmickry or manipulation that Poe uses that some deem non-literary. Montrezor, after all, does pull us in through Poe's ventriloquist manipulation of him manipulating us as readers, and it can seem a bit heavy-handed on Poe's part. But that, we realize, is just what a good or great story, especially a suspense story, is supposed to do. You could almost say it's a suspense or horror storyteller's mandate. The story remains a masterpiece because of its totality and its seminal role in masterful storytelling. What may appear somewhat crude in Poe becomes more stylized and highly developed as the genre of short fiction develops. Julio Cortázar, a short story writer who wrote a book on the beginnings of the modern impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision. "We will go back. Your health is precious." We know, of course, that he's ensnaring him. He's bringing him in, and it moves us forward, as I said, in a relentless way. He's playing with them. It's like a spider and a fly, saying, "Oh, well, you know, you're coughing. We'll take you back. We'll go back," and so forth. But we know we're moving on, and indeed we do march on. And revenge is, let's face it, a powerful and universal human emotion. It's what pulls us in, even though we don't know why this man is seeking revenge against Fortunato. When you have a lot of skeletons in a subterranean vault, it's hard not to think of your own mortality. The story's first 3 paragraphs really serve as a perfect setting up or exposition of all that follows in rising and falling action, and the voice in the story is masterfully sustained. It keeps us compelled to stay with the story right up to the end. I want to, in fact, just read an excerpt from the end of the story. "It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished tantalizing than Poe. You might ask the question, why is early fiction so fixated on horror? Well, because magazines were where horror stories appeared. Magazines were where stories appeared, and horror was what magazine writers craved, what magazine readers craved. Could a writer make readers quake in fear with the notion that one could actually murder with impunity, escape moral or eternal judgment as secularism and loss of faith continue to rise? Well, The Cask of Amontillado is a realistic, true-to-life story, a well-made tale driven by plot and a realism, or what we call verisimilitude, being true to life, that will dominate the 19th century, even though with Hawthorne and Gogol we see stories that veer off into the supernatural. The Cask of Amontillado is Gothic, gloomy, grotesque, and violent, an arabesque, intricate in its design, but it cleaves to standards of realism, as do the other masters of the well-made tale of the 19th century, like Guy de Maupassant, Anton Chekhov, and Henry James, who wrote a famous supernatural, haunting ghost story called The Turn of the Screw. Despite the ventures into the supernatural in Hawthorne and Gogol and a seminal writer like Washington Irving, we remain largely tethered in 19th century storytelling to a strong sense of realism and credibility. Stories, as we shall see, become more complicated in craft and technique and in character. Great stories are connected to other great stories and build on their predecessors in a tapestry of intertextuality. Poe and Hawthorne admired and wrote about each other's work, and our next lecture will be on Hawthorne, another of the great 19th century American storytellers, an author of a tale that is generally regarded as his most compelling. The sense of fiendishness, the frightful, the horrific, and the demonic, as you'll see, resonates in this other American master as well. But we owe a lion's share of credit to Poe for masterfully bringing us into the world we recognize as that of the genre of the short story, and of providing much of, well, forgive the apt metaphor, the mortar and masonry that created for us a whole new way of envisioning fiction.